Good day, everybody. Yeah, what a wonderful symposium so far this morning. And thank you for everybody joining. We are now going to move over to Jonathan Bosworth and Melinda Swift to take it further from us. Jonathan, Melinda.
Thank you very much, Chris. Chris, if I could ask you to please just let me know when I'm about 10 minutes in, just so I can get very excited and talk all day, just so I can know when I need to start wrapping up. Okay, good morning, everyone. So my name is Jonathan. I'm a counselling psychologist in Johannesburg, and I'm presenting on behalf of myself and Melinda. So Melinda's a parent of a trans adolescent. She's also been a part of the team that's been helping the Department of Basic Education develop the guidelines for schools. And I'm going to be speaking about our experience from working with a support group for educators, for support space for educators working with gender diversity. Move this out of the way. Okay, so Melinda and I have a history of kind of running a support space for parents, and we know that this has really helped kind of thinking, I suppose, kind of maybe to zoom out first, actually. So I think kind of just knowing that gender diversity is not an individual problem, but rather this is a societal problem. And I think for me, it's been really important to locate how do we start changing communities and societies? And I think that's kind of been a lot of the thinking that Melinda and I have been doing, and we've run a support space for parents over the last 3.5 years. And I know we've already made a lot of difference with that. There's something about, kind of hearing from a gender diverse child or hearing from a healthcare professional, but there's something very different about hearing from parents, hearing about from other parents and getting support from other parents, and that kind of the change that creates. But we know with our support space, in that sense, kind of schools have often been an ongoing concern, ongoing difficulty. I think also just kind of working as a psychologist, as a therapist, often there are significant challenges with school environments that kind of, even if a child is getting inadequate support from home or support, kind of mental health support, actually if the school environment is still stuck, if there's bullying from teachers or peers, we know that this continues to create further mental health difficulties. I think also both Melinda and I do consult with schools, but often, and I think I'm glad this was brought up actually in other areas of today's symposium so far, but often the work is very introductory. You get an hour and a half, 2 hours if you're lucky to kind of introduce kind of ideas around gender diversity, but it doesn't go very far. And I think there's also often a checklist approach. We've done an introductory talk now, we can step back and leave things, or there's often a once-off workshop, but we know that there's a lot of complexity to doing work in this area, and I think there's often a concern around actually how sustainable is this. How do we get things to kind of be sustainable and have a greater impact? Okay, so kind of in 2021, what actually happened was Matimba and Explore kind of actually collaborated to create an online CPD course on gender diversity in schools. And I think really what we decided was then actually to try think about sustainability. And from the course, actually then launched the group, actually kind of not just kind of having some introductory sessions and some broader sessions, but actually then how do we take things further and make sure that educators are working towards sustainable change in their school environments. So this group's been going over for just over a year. We host kind of free monthly online meetings. The group is predominantly attended by educators from well-resourced schools, from your metros, and also kind of largely represented by teachers in high school settings. But I think they've also have had pre-primary and primary participation. I've really also been thinking about how do we obviously capture educators working with diverse age groups, but particularly the importance of actually working with younger children and thinking about these things from scratch rather than only trying to introduce these ideas in high school. So I largely educate myself in community psychology, but I think I've also really found kind of Winnicott's idea of a holding environment really important, that actually just often creating a safe space actually allows a person to grow and develop and become their true selves. And I think often we think about this in an individual setting, but we know this really helps in a broader setting as also. If we can create holding environments, I think that really makes a big difference. So that was also kind of a broad idea around actually how do we make sustainable change, but also how do we create environments that allows for that sustainable change, and how do we hold the people that also do the holding in those environments. Okay, so I think kind of what's been really interesting, and I think why I was quite excited to kind of present today, is actually kind of what we expected to do and actually what we've experienced. And I think that's been a lot of learning for me. And I think this is applicable to actually thinking about how do we help educators and people in school environments. But I think this is also some stuff that we need to think about in relation to healthcare professionals and training healthcare professionals. I'm glad there's been a lot of tension around things like sensitization training today, and actually what really kind of helps people access gender affirming healthcare. So I think also kind of holding that in mind. So I think actually what Melinda and I went into thinking was thinking that actually we're going to be doing a lot more teaching. There's going to be a lot more practical problem solving, implementing that best practice, and talking about things about how do you use a person's name and pronouns, and what should change rooms and bathrooms look like, and how do we develop policy. And I think we have done some of that stuff, but actually that stuff seems quite secondary actually in the group. So actually really what happened when we formed the group was that the group actually really highlighted their vulnerability as educators working in this area. And they requested the group to become a closed group with their own safety and extensive engagement. Okay, so that was a really big change around actually this is not just an open space. We're not just here to problem solve, but actually we are really vulnerable and we are needing help, but actually we need a safe space to be able to do that. And I think this is really where I think the core thing for me today, and I think kind of probably the core message for the presentation is kind of actually where a lot of changes really seem to be springboarded is from in-depth social and emotional processing, really being able to sit with difficult things, unpack personal and professional things, and kind of just sit together and make sense of things together. And I think kind of that's actually led us away from actually the teaching type of model, but rather to an educating and a holding type of model. And I think that really where sustainable change seems to be coming from in the group. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do now is kind of I'm going to talk about I think kind of experiences from the group around what educators really face, but then I think then leading that kind of thinking about actually how do we meet the needs of educators in really helping in really helping create change. So I think kind of being an educator and doing this work is incredibly difficult. Often it's quite new. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's learning on the ground. There's figuring things out as you go along. I think there's also really difficult and ethical questions around kind of what is best for the learner, what is best for the school community. And I think often then being trapped between different entities, kind of being trapped by between school management, really worried about parental backlash, worried about student backlash. Actually, you're kind of almost being this middle person in a way that actually kind of trying to meet the needs of many different people. But I think in a kind of controversial issues, obviously really being trapped in that. And I think that does take a massive emotional toll. And I think kind of also freezes up educators and actually being able to do the work. Actually, is it okay for me to do this, or am I going to get into trouble for doing something? And I think particularly, I think in the last few years, I think there has been a much greater extent around kind of cancel culture and school capture. So actually how easy it is for teachers to be named and shamed and to be shut down and not to be able to make mistakes, not be able to do things, and often sometimes not really being able to do things in a kind of a paced out, slower, kind of thoughtful manner, but often things just happen very quickly. And I think that creates a lot of anxiety and makes it very difficult to think about things and process things. I think often also fear of disciplinary action and losing a job. So kind of worried about if I do this, actually, am I going to be backed up by my employer, or am I going to actually get into trouble for this? Worry about professional reputation. I know that was actually one of the reasons we also closed the group was actually the fear of, can I speak out, and am I going to be seen differently by my colleagues? Is this going to hamper my future employment? I think these are actually really genuine concerns that educators sit with. I think also kind of the challenges of navigating relationships are something that's often come up in the group, and kind of how do we manage different beliefs and different practices with peers. I think particularly sitting with, I'm really trying to help a trans learner, I'm really trying to help the school actually kind of think about diversity more, but I'm actually sitting with my peers that are saying something that's completely different to me, or going against me, or in a very different place in their processing of diversity, and how do I navigate that? So I know that can also be quite a challenge. But I think kind of also thinking about one's own diversity and intersectionality. I think we often, we can't work with our identity without challenging our own identities. And I think that's also been a really important part of the group, is thinking about things personally. Often, we talk about, I mentioned earlier on, but often, we talk about trans people as something that's kind of a concept, rather than actually these are people, or these are actually part of our own identities, our own queerness, our own diversity. And I think that's been really important in the group, is actually been able to have that processing on a very individual level. Like, what does this mean for me? What buttons are being pushed? What am I going through? And I think also like allowing educators to be diverse. There's kind of this weird notion that in order to be a legitimate educator, you need to be cis-het and present in certain ways. Actually, we're kind of, what is the diversity even on a staff level? How do we also think about and engage with that? Okay, so I think those are kind of some of the challenges, but I think the kind of the needs that are quite important. So obviously, I think from a leadership and policy perspective, and I know Ron's really good at kind of structuring this framework and kind of outlaying this, is kind of actually in order for educators to do their job and in order for educators to kind of do work in diversity, transformation, and inclusion, they do need support from top down, so from the constitution, from school management, from school governing bodies, but also from policy. So that's really been important. And I think obviously kind of partly creating a safe space or holding space is actually feeling safe and supported. So I think that is a really key thing. It's been really nice to have school leaders actually as part of the group. So I think that's also made quite a big difference. When the leaders are actually present and actually engaging with the stuff, and that actually does filter down to creating a safe space. Okay, and I think that this is, for me, I think the core part of where the group's actually gone is actually really about the in-depth processing and development. So I think this is kind of, I think, a really key need that I think we often don't think about enough. So we do have best practice, we have understanding, we have the guidelines coming up, which I think is going to be really helpful. But a lot of this is very cognitive. It's a little bit more distant, a little bit more abstract, a little bit more problem solving. But actually what is really embodied and what actually kind of helps individuals kind of create change is for me the really kind of the in-depth processing and development. So I think kind of different cool. Thank you, Chris. So different ways of supporting educators is kind of really thinking about the need for emotional containment. Actually, this can be very stressful and overwhelming. How do we pace things out? How do we think about things and slow down? And how do we hold difficult feelings? I think also the importance of having a space to learn, the importance of being able to make mistakes, being able to fumble, to be able to struggle, to grapple. I think particularly with things like cancel culture, it's been very difficult for people to be able to speak out and say, I need help, or I'm struggling with this, or might get it wrong, but how do I improve on this? And so I think that's also become something that's quite unique and harder to actually, I think, access for many people. I think also, as I mentioned just now, the importance of engaging with one's own identities, but also the importance of intersectionality, actually, that kind of, you can't talk about transformation with regards to gender and sexuality without talking about race, religion, culture, disability, neurodiversity, other forms of identity. So I think that's also been really important to grapple with and to be pushed on. But I think for me, ultimately, I think in order to have sustainable change and well-being on an individual and a community level, we also need kind of authentic and true self-development. And I think this does really require intensive kind of social and emotional processing. Okay, obviously also resources are important. I think there's something about also kind of just having the group once a month, there's time to start thinking about this, to push things off, to access social capital, to access peer support, and that also makes quite a big difference. But you obviously also need to think about access in other forms and how to create kind of boost educators with that, providing resources. Okay, so I think kind of one of the key points for me is also kind of really thinking about, it's really exciting that there are kind of guidelines promised by the Department of Education that are being vetted and going through those processes. But I think actually really, we know, I think a lot from, for example, kind of sex education, is that we can have curriculum or we can have guidelines, but if the educator is not able to embody those, they're quite ineffective. So I think we really need to think about that. It's really great to have guidelines, but actually what are the next step after these guidelines come into place? How do we offer spaces that allow for this personal, this emotional and social processing? I think that's going to make a really big difference. I think the importance of having safe spaces, having peer support, I think these are really critical. I think also kind of incorporating these in teacher training. I think teacher training shouldn't just be a cognitive exercise, obviously introducing ideas and understandings, but actually how do we get people to truly engage with kind of the social emotional part of actually working with diversity, inclusion and kind of transformation. So I think kind of maybe just some of the challenges thinking about where we are as a group, is actually kind of how do we access broader kind of diversity in the schools that we work with. So kind of less resource schools. Also, I suppose kind of with the guidelines coming into place, schools are going to be pushed to be doing this work, but what happens if schools aren't motivated or educators aren't motivated to do this work? Also accessing teachers that are vulnerable, kind of that maybe aren't supported in their institutions or don't have as much social capital. Accessing kind of educators that work with younger children. Also, there's kind of quite a representation of girls' schools in the group, but actually kind of historically boys' schools actually are really underrepresented and kind of, I think, really need assistance in this area. also how to access more support staff, kind of also thinking about that interdisciplinary collaboration. I think that's also been one of the benefit of kind of actually coming together and creating a difference. So that's the theme of the symposium, but actually as a healthcare professional, psychologist, a parent, and educators working together, I think that's really opened up something quite different, is actually kind of thinking about things from different lenses. I think that also has created something quite unique. I think a more recent challenge is kind of actually the need for a separate group for school leadership and management. Actually, that sometimes actually having your principal, your headmaster in the same group as you, we realize that actually might actually be a bit of conflict of interest. Our educators, our teachers on the ground, are they going to be able to speak out, and are they going to be able to do as much processing? So actually thinking about creating a separate group, I think, would be quite beneficial. But I think then also the importance of collaboration with parents and caregivers and learners. So I think kind of what was really great, we had the last meeting for this year on Tuesday this week, and it was actually a dialogue between the parent support group and the educator support space, and that was actually really special and unique. And I think, really thinking about how do we sustainably create change. We do need actually not just educators to be doing this work, but collaborating with parents and caregivers and learners, and I think coming together to really create sustainable change does require that collaboration. I think, again, speaking to the topic of the symposium, but I think it's a very real concern and a very important consideration. So I'm looking forward to seeing the group continue to grow and develop, but also hearing thoughts and comments and suggestions from this space, and how we can improve, or how we can share these ideas in other spaces. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jonathan. Is there anybody in the space that would like to ask a question? I know we are running over time, but it would be great to have one or two questions. Okay, at this stage, I don't see any hands. Just that was great, Jonathan, from Pierre. So I think let's move then over to the next group that's going to
Chris, I think Ronald had his hand up. I don't know, or their hand up.
Oh, Ron, yes, please.
Yeah, it's more just a reflection, Jonathan, than a question. I do hope you're planning to write this up and publish it. And my thought, just listening to the development of what you've learned from facilitating this very unique type of group, if it can't be national, at least every province, I think, should think about duplicating a similar kind of space, at least at each province, even in smaller kind of geographical segments for the support. But yeah, just compliments to the work that this group has done, and it's unique, and it's yeah, I think a lot to be learned from it.
Thank you very much, Ron.
Thank you, Ron.